Hello and welcome to part 2 of session 17 in homeopathic medicine. So here are some concepts on this slide that are seen across various types of homeopathic practice to the present day. And these are concepts, some of which have evolved greatly over time beyond Hahnemann, much of that being in the hands of James Tyler Kent, who we will meet in the next section of this lecture. And they certainly don't represent a comprehensive list of all the modern methodological approaches to homeopathic practice, but they will give you a general idea of some of the framework that has developed over time. So we've already touched upon the law of similars in the last section of this lecture, but we'll expand on that some with some examples in this section. The principle of like cures like implies that the homeopathic practitioner seeks to create the closest match between the symptoms exhibited by the patient and those symptoms created by the proving of the selected remedy on healthy individuals. So here's an example of that. Imagine that you had never had coffee before, and then all of a sudden you had 12 cups of espresso. So some of the symptoms that you might develop would include insomnia, palpitations of your heart, sweating, anxiety, restlessness, and other things that I'm sure that you can imagine if you've ever had too much coffee before. So a homeopathic practitioner might prescribe a homeopathic preparation of what's called cafea cruda, which is made from coffee beans, for those symptoms. Not the symptoms of having too much coffee, but the symptoms of things like insomnia, palpitations, sweating, anxiety, and restlessness. So some pediatricians are also somewhat following the law of similars by prescribing regular coffee in small doses for people with ADHD. And the drug Ritalin also follows the law of like cures like, because Ritalin is a stimulant, but when it's prescribed for people with ADHD, it has a calming effect. However, given that those types of approaches in mainstream medicine are not looking at the totality of the symptom picture, but only one major symptom, these aren't truly uses that are in keeping with the law of similars, but they're just something that we can use to say, okay, this isn't a completely foreign concept in conventional medicine. Moving on to the concept of the minute dose, which is about dilution of a remedy. So this states that treatment involves small doses of a natural substance which amplifies the beneficial effects of the medicine whilst removing any toxicity. So soluble substances are prepared into what's called mother tinctures, and that uses a similar process to herbal tinctures or extractions, which are generally done in a mixture of alcohol and water with the crude herb. And then the mother tinctures are diluted to create homeopathic remedies of different potencies. So when Hahnemann first started experimenting with dilution, the goal was to reduce the toxic side effects of the substances that he was using. He wasn't testing this to see if things got more powerful as they were more diluted. He was just trying to say, how small of a dose can I give of a toxic substance so that I can reduce the toxic effects of that and still have a curative effect on the patient who's ill. So in his experimentation, in the long run, he discovered that the more dilute a substance was, the deeper acting it was. And thus it is said that the more dilute remedies are the ones of higher potency than the remedies that are less diluted. Now, I'll say that again. The more diluted a remedy is, the more potent it is thought to be than the remedies that are less diluted. There's a second component to making a more dilute substance have a greater action, and we'll see that on the next slide. In present-day practice, dilutions are beyond the point at which any material action could be expected from the substance. And as I said on the last slide, we have a second step to making a remedy more potent, and that is called potentization. Hahnemann discovered that dilution, when it was combined with what he called succussion, which is vigorous shaking, increased the substance's medicinal effect. And he called this new dynamized medicines. He continued to experiment with different methods of dilution and succussion in order to improve the results of the remedies on the actual patients. And possibly the succussion idea was a combination of concepts from chemistry and alchemy. From the organon of medicine, which is arranged into what are called aphorisms. This is aphorism number 277, and it references in the first line there aphorism number 275. And this relates to the minimum dose of a medicine being given. For the same reason as cited in aphorism 275, since a well-dynamized medicine whose dose is properly small becomes all the more curative and helpful, almost to the point of wonder, the more homeopathically it was searched out, it follows that a medicine whose apt selection has been homeopathically hit upon must also be all the more curative, the more its dose descends to the appropriate degree of smallness for gentle aid. So the principle of minimum dose implies that the practitioner should be mindful of carefully watching each patient's response to a dosing of a remedy, and if the cure is heading in the right direction, then no additional dosing is needed unless the progress towards a cure stops. This aligns with the concept of the vital force, which we'll talk about later. And in our lecture on the history of naturopathy, we'll also see that philosophy again, of stimulating the vital force only enough to get the healing process headed in the right direction, and then leaving the body's natural healing capacities to do the rest. That began with Father Sebastian Kneipp, who was also a German. As Samuel Hahnemann was. And he is the grandfather of modern naturopathic medicine. So we've already talked about provings in the last part of this lecture, and this is just a little bit more detail on that in the present day. So provings are unique to homeopathy. They are still used today to establish new remedies on an ongoing basis, and the data derived from provings provides the basis for the homeopathic materia medica and for the various repertories that they all are. And these are the books that are used to research and determine the appropriate remedy for a patient. The high toxicity of some of the substances that are used in homeopathy in their remedy pictures for approving have to be established only using toxicology reports, because it wouldn't be obviously safe or ethical to give a highly toxic substance in a material dose to a test approver. And so using toxicology reports on substances that we know to be toxic to determine what the symptoms are of a person who might have accidentally ingested that substance. And then also clinical use of potentized remedies, the diluted and dynamized medicines, is used to supplement the data on those toxic substances as well in the modern provings. So the method that Hahnemann used to establish what's called the symptom picture for each substance or remedy tested is what we're talking about here. And today, Hahnemann's provings would fall under what we term qualitative research. He was working to match patterns from qualitative data that was reported from the test subjects, and that is still true in provings today. The next guiding principle of homeopathy is to look at the totality of symptoms. So again, here we have a holistic approach to the patient, looking at the totality of the characteristic symptoms of the disease on the mental, physical, and emotional levels. And when the total symptom picture is examined, it will give a match to the symptom picture of the remedy that is the best one to apply to that patient. So symptoms are to be observed and to be listened to and not to be suppressed in homeopathy. They represent the expression of the disease, and so we have a lot to learn from looking at and listening to the patient and what their symptoms are. Symptoms are the signposts that practitioners and patients must learn to observe and understand and follow in order to arrive at a state of optimum health. So a symptom can either be the result of the cause of disease directly or the result of the body's attempt to defend itself against the causes of disease. And an example of that is a fever, which is the body's attempt to rid itself of a microorganism. So it's this guiding concept of the totality of symptoms that often creates confusion, or a basis for argument at least, about homeopathy as a holistic and curative modality. So it's argued that if the focus is on all the minute symptoms and finding a remedy with all those same minute little symptoms, then the focus of the medicine must be to remove those symptoms. But that is not the case, and it's really important to understand that. The focus on the symptoms is a method of inductive reasoning that is used to identify the proper remedy, but the action of the remedy itself will be curative rather than simply suppressing or removing the symptoms. So without going too far into some very complex theory, which is beyond the scope of this subject, the basic concept is that the disease produced by the remedy, when it's taken, provides a very specific stimulus to the patient's vital force that allows the vital force to overcome the original disease in the person. So it is said that the remedy is itself providing a disease stimulus through the types of symptoms that it would elicit in a healthy person. The right remedy is therefore curative, and it's not taking the action of suppressing symptoms. The next principle or guidepost in homeopathy is individuality. Again, this is a holistic approach, looking to the particular manifestation of a disease in a person along with that person's particular constitutional traits and tendencies. And when we talk about constitutional traits in this context, we might be referring to things like whether the person tends to run hot or cold, what types of food they crave or are adverse to, whether one side of the body or the other tends to be more affected in illness. But we're also talking about how an individual person manifests an illness. So have you ever lived in a home with a group of people, either your family or roommates or whatever, where the same cold moved through everyone in the home in a wave, so everybody eventually got it? And what are you able to observe in that circumstance about how that cold manifested differently in each individual? Because everybody will tend to have a slightly different set of symptoms when they have that same cold, right? So this overlaps somewhat with the totality of symptoms that we were just talking about on the last slide. But think about yourself and how do you manifest a cold? Does your nose tend to run a lot, or do you tend to have more drainage down the back of your throat instead? Do you tend to lose your voice when you get a sore throat or not? Does the infection tend to move quickly down into your chest and hang out there for a while, or do things tend to clear quickly without going down into your chest and sticking there? All of those are different kinds of individual manifestations of illness, as well as manifestations of the strength of a person's vitality. And those are based on individual constitution and susceptibilities. And so a homeopath will always pay special attention to what is unique in the case and what is unique about that individual in how they're manifesting symptoms. And now the vital force, and we've talked about the vital force and different concepts of that throughout this semester in different systems of medicine, and this is the concept of that in homeopathy. The remedy provides a specific stimulus to the person's vital force in order to effect a cure of the disease. The body itself is said to be correcting the state of ill health, and thus it is strengthened. And the vital force is also relied upon to keep the body well when the body is treated with care. And I mentioned that Hahnemann placed a lot of emphasis on different types of self-care and natural support of the body's vital force. So homeopathy as a system of medicine is entirely vitalistic, especially with the dilution of medicines used today, which are such that there can't be any explainable mechanism of action in the body that's based on material impact on a biochemical pathway or a physiology. Although laboratory testing at this point in time does distinguish homeopathic remedies from inert substances due to the presence of nanoparticles. So there is also some effect on photon emissions and even activity in chemical reactions when a homeopathic remedy that is very dilute is combined with other things. So even though we haven't entirely explained how the remedy is impacting on the body's biochemistry, if it's impacting the biochemistry at all, it is possible that nanopharmacy will end up holding the key that explains that in the future. So here's an example of how we can help conceptualize how the body is stimulated to health itself. Though this particular example is based on something that's really completely explainable by physiological mechanisms. If you have a mild burn, say you burned your hand a bit when you were cooking, have you ever experienced what happens when you take the burn and you place it under cold running water? It will tend to feel better while it's under the water, and then when you turn the water off or you take your hand out from under, it can actually hurt even worse than before, like it's on fire. I had this happen to me once. It was not a burn in the kitchen. It was a burn from 25 feet worth of a lead rope from a horse running through my hand very quickly as the horse was bolting away from me, and my hand got tangled in the rope. And I held my hand under cold running water for as long as I could stand it. And when I took it out, my hand just felt 100 times worse than it had before I had even put it under the water at all. So this is because the action of the cold water, which is contrary treatment to the burn. So the burn creates heat and you're placing cold onto that heat. So that's a contrary treatment. It's opposing what's going on in the skin. Then that stimulates in your body thermoreceptors within your skin to cause vasodilation in the hand. So your body will send more blood out to the hand when the cold water runs on the hand, and thermoreceptors in the skin go, oh, my hand is really, really cold now. And the body's physiological response to that is to send more blood to the hand to help to warm it up. And so when more blood goes somewhere, more heat goes there as well. And that's why if you take your hand out from under the cold water, it will feel worse for a little while because the body is trying desperately to heat that hand up, because that cold water, the message that's being sent by the cold water is for the body to heat that hand up. But if you run your burn under slightly warm, tepid water, not hot water, because you don't want to heat the skin further when you're burned, but under tepid water, barely warm, that actually allows the heat of the burn to be removed by the water, because the burned skin is hotter than the water is. So the tepid water will take that heat away, just like if you put a child with a high fever into a tepid bath. That carries the heat away from the body. But the thermoreceptors that are on the skin of the hand will not be stimulated to send more blood flow to the hand, because you're not running the cold water on it. You're running sort of body temperature or slightly warmer water onto it. And so the response that is there naturally to the burn, the body will be able to do its natural thing to respond to that burn, because it's not getting that cold message. And so that can kind of help to conceptualize how a homeopathic remedy works. It is stimulating the vital force to do what the vital force does naturally, which is to bring the body back to a state of health. And in the instance of the burn, if you're not giving that cold message, then the body can go ahead and do its natural thing that it's going to do with the burn, which is to try and cool down that area. And the tepid water is also helping to cool that down. So it's inherent in the vitalistic nature of homeopathic medicine, as we'll see with naturopathy in a week or so. The idea that in order for the vital force to be as robust as possible, things that disturb the vital force or put it under duress should be avoided to the greatest extent possible. And things that diminish the vitality are seen to be causes of illness, and those causes need to be removed in order for the vital force to do its job unabated. Hahnemann didn't believe that the remedies were the only thing necessary to cure the disease. He believed that the remedies must be used in combination with lifestyle changes, as I mentioned before, and removing the disturbing factors that were in place in the patient's life. And the last of the guiding guideposts in homeopathy is the single remedy. So the classical homeopathy utilizes only one remedy at a time, not a mixture of remedies. And you'll see now that we have things on the market like combination remedies that have multiple different substances in them. And some of them that I've used are fantastic. There's one called No Jet Lag that's made by a company in New Zealand, and that is miraculous for flights to and from the United States. And that's a combination remedy. I think it has 5 or 6 different homeopathic substances in it. But classical homeopathy is using only one remedy at a time and not a mixture of remedies. And it's based on the theory that a person can only suffer from one disease at a time. So all the symptoms are of the one disease, and there will be one remedy that matches that picture. And so that's classical homeopathy, and as I said, that's developed sort of differently over time in different offshoots of classical or constitutional homeopathy. So we're at the end of part 2. Your revision questions are there, as well as on the LMS, and your other food for thought for this part. What is your personal sense of the theory and evidence underlying homeopathic medicine at this stage? Everybody will develop an opinion about homeopathy. It's almost impossible not to, as it's quite an interesting thing to debate these days. So give that some thought and see if you can land on how you feel about this at this point in time, or what your personal sense of it is. So that's it for part 2. Thank you for joining, and I will see you in part 3.